Real estate words and terms with meanings and examples, part number 12. Specific performance, which means a legal remedy where a court requires a party to fulfill their obligations under a contract. For example, the buyer sued for specific performance when the seller refused to complete the sale. Square footage, which means the measurement of the size of a property or space in square feet. For instance, the apartment offers 1,200 square feet of living space. Staging, which means preparing and decorating a property to make it more appealing to buyers. For example, the agent recommended staging the home with modern furniture to attract more offers. Subdivision, which means a tract of land divided into smaller lots for development or sale. For instance, the new subdivision will feature 50 single-family homes. Sublease, which means an agreement where a tenant rents out their leased property to another person. For example, she decided to sublease her apartment while she was working overseas. Subordinate clause, which means a mortgage or lien that is given a lower priority compared to another lien. For instance, the lender agreed to a subordinate clause so the borrower could refinance the first mortgage. Survey, which means a detailed map showing property boundaries, features, and measurements. For example, the buyer ordered a survey to confirm the exact size of the lot. Tax lien, which means a legal claim by the government against a property for unpaid taxes. For instance, the property could not be sold until the tax lien was cleared. Tenancy in common, which means a form of ownership where two or more people own property together without rights of survivorship. For example, the siblings held the cabin as tenants in common, each owning 50%. Tenant, which means a person who rents or leases a property from a landlord. For instance, the tenant must pay rent on the first day of each month. Termite inspection, which means a professional examination to check for termite damage or infestation. For example, the lender required a termite inspection before approving the loan. Title, which means the legal right to own and use property. For instance, the title to the house was transferred to the new owner at closing. Title company, which means a business that verifies property titles and issues title insurance. For example, the title company ensured there were no liens before the sale. Title insurance, which means insurance protecting against losses from defects in the property title. For instance, title insurance covered the buyer when an undisclosed lien was discovered. Title search, which means the process of reviewing public records to confirm a property's legal ownership. For example, the title search showed no outstanding claims on the property. Townhouse, which means a multi-story home that shares walls with neighboring units. For instance, they bought a 3-bedroom townhouse in a gated community. Transfer tax, which means a fee charged by the government when property changes ownership. For example, the buyer had to pay a transfer tax at closing. Triple net lease, NNN, which means a lease where the tenant pays rent plus property taxes, insurance, and maintenance. For instance, the commercial space was offered under a triple net lease agreement. Trust, which means a legal arrangement where property is held by one party for the benefit of another. For example, the property was placed in a trust for the children's inheritance. Trustee, which means a person or entity that manages a trust. For instance, the trustee handled the sale of the property according to the trust terms. Underwriting, which means the process lenders use to evaluate the risk of granting a loan. For example, the mortgage application is still in underwriting. Unilateral contract, which means an agreement where only one party makes a promise or obligation. For instance, a listing agreement offering payment only if the agent finds a buyer is a unilateral contract. Use variance, which means permission to use land in a way not normally allowed by zoning laws. For example, the city granted a use variance for the property to operate as a cafe. Usury, which means charging interest rates above the legal limit. For instance, the loan was voided because it violated state usury laws. VA loan, which means a mortgage loan guaranteed by the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs for eligible veterans. For example, he purchased his first home with no down payment using a VA loan.